Hello, this is Thad Hall with Marsh Group. In this video, we'll be reviewing Section B of the Election Administration and Voting Survey. Section B covers the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, or UOCAVA. Before we begin, it'll be helpful for you to have two documents with you as we review these slides. First, you will want to have a copy of the Election Administration and Voting Survey instrument, and second, a copy of the Supplemental Instruction Manual. The Supplemental Instruction Manual is especially important for Section B because of the definitions it contains, as well as information on a couple of questions that have been deleted from the survey. So what is in Section B? Section B has three primary components. First, the total number of UOCAVA registrants for the 2016 general election. Second, the total number of federal postcard applications, or FPCAs, that were fully processed and the number not fully processed by your office in 2016. And finally, the total number of transmitted ballots and the total number of federal write-in absentee ballots that were cast, counted, and rejected. In Section B, you will often be reporting three sets of numbers. First, you'll be reporting the total number of UOCAVA ballots, and then you'll be breaking those ballots up into two groups. Ballots that were submitted or transmitted or counted and rejected by uniformed services voters and by overseas citizens. You'll be reporting those separately. There are several concepts that need to be defined before we delve into the questions in Section B. First, let's discuss the difference between a uniformed services voter and a U.S. citizen residing outside the United States. A uniformed service voter is either a member of the uniformed services, so that would be somebody who's in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, or Coast Guard, as well as a person who's in the Merchant Marines, the Public Health Service Commission Corps, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Those individuals are obviously uniformed service voters. However, the key thing to note here is their eligible family members are also uniformed services voters, as long as that eligible family member is absent from the place of residence where they're eligible to vote. So, for example, if I am a member of the Army, I'm obviously covered. But if I'm the spouse of somebody who's in the Army and I am living away from my place of residence where I'm eligible to vote, so if I'm eligible to vote in California, but I'm at a base in Georgia, I'm the spouse, I am considered to be a uniformed services voter covered by UOCAVA. In addition, if I was overseas and I'm married to somebody who's in the Army and I'm with them at their base in Germany, again, I am a uniformed services voter. So this is important to note because the U.S. citizens residing outside the United States, these are people who are not uniformed services voters. So the people who are considered U.S. citizens residing outside the United States are not people who are in the military or their spouses and dependents. It's important to make that differentiation. So who is covered by UOCAVA? Well, first, any individual who registers to vote and requests an absentee ballot using the Federal Postcard Application, or FPCA, is considered a UOCAVA voter. However, your state may have additional coverage for certain types of individuals. For most of Section B, you should use your state's definition of UOCAVA to answer the question. However, for questions about FPCAs, you should only report registrants who use the FPCA. So for instance, if your state has a form that allows people to request UOCAVA status, for the questions about FPCAs, you should only report the people who use the FPCA. But for all the other questions, you should use your state's definition, which would include individuals who noted on a state registration form that they had UOCAVA status. So what's the difference between a transmitted ballot and a FWAB? A transmitted ballot is a ballot that originates in your office. So it's a ballot that you sent to the voter. You may have sent it by postal mail or email or fax or posted it on an online portal, but you transmitted that ballot to the voter. And this can be contrasted with a federal write-in absentee ballot, which originates from the voter. So often, if a voter does not receive their ballot on time or there's some sort of other issue, they will complete a federal write-in absentee ballot. And in this case, they list the office for which they want to vote, and they either list the candidate's name or the political party for whom they're casting a ballot, and then that is sent in. So that is how you can differentiate between the transmitted ballot and the federal write-in and absentee ballot. The key way to think about it is, where did the ballot originate? Did it originate from the voter, or did it originate in your office? So Section B is actually different a little bit in 2016 compared to 2014. As some of you know, in 2014, the Federal Voting Assistance Program combined a survey they had been doing separately about UOCAVA voting, where they've been asking local election officials questions about the UOCAVA voting process. They combined it with Section B of the Election Administration and Voting Survey. However, when they combined it, it turned out there were some duplicative questions. And so the Federal Voting Assistance Program worked with the Council of State Governments Overseas Voting Initiative, and a group of state and local election officials worked together to identify these duplicative questions, and they presented a proposal to the EAC to remove certain questions from the 2016 Election Administration and Voting Survey. And the EAC has adopted that recommendation. And so for the 2016 EAVS, you do not have to answer the questions that you see on the slide. And I will be emphasizing the questions that have been removed as we go through this presentation. So question B1A is starting off by asking you how many ballots your office transmitted to UOCAVA voters. And so B1A is the total, and then for B1B and B1C, you're going to be dividing this up between the uniformed service voter and the overseas citizens. B1B and B1C should obviously total B1A. Question B2 is asking what happened to each of the ballots that your jurisdiction sent out. First, how many were returned by UOCAVA voters? Second, how many were returned by the post office as undeliverable? And third, how many were returned as spoiled or were replacement ballots? B2D is just asking how many of the ballots that you sent out were not returned by a voter, returned by the post office, or spoiled. So basically, B2A through B2D should total back up to B1A, the total number of ballots you sent out. So now we come to a series of questions you're allowed to skip. You should not be providing answers to questions 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Question 8 is asking about how many UOCAVA ballots were counted. So if you included a ballot in your jurisdiction's canvas of results, it was considered counted. And you're going to be talking here about the total number of ballots. So here you want to talk about both the transmitted ballots and the FWABs. So B8A is a total of all ballots, both FWABs and transmitted ballots. B9 is just asking for you to subdivide the number of ballots counted by the person who cast that ballot. Were they a uniformed service voter, or were they an overseas citizen voter? So the total number of ballots cast that were counted that were sent in by a uniformed service voter is B9A, and B9B is the number of counted ballots that were cast by overseas citizen voters. There is a B9C option. You should only use it if you cannot divide the UOCAVA ballots counted between the uniformed service voter population and the overseas citizen voter population. So now we want to know how many of the ballots that were counted were cast by a uniformed service voter or an overseas citizen voter. But here in B10, we're looking at the transmitted ballots. So how many of the ballots that you sent out to voters were counted? And then for B11 is the number of FWABs that were counted. So how many of the federal write-in and absentee ballots were counted? And how many of those counted ballots were cast by either a uniformed services voter or an overseas citizen voter? So next we're getting into the number of UOCAVA ballots that were rejected and why were they rejected. So B13 is the total number of ballots. Again, here we're combining transmitted ballots and FWABs. How many of these total UOCAVA ballots were rejected? And then for questions 14A, B, C, and so on, how many of them were rejected? Were they received after the deadline? Was there a problem with the signature? If you're in a state that requires a postmark, was the ballot missing a postmark? So in the B14 series, you'll be reporting why the ballots were rejected. For B15, you'll be reporting the total number of ballots that were rejected and breaking it out by either uniform service voters or overseas citizen voters. And again, please only use B15C as an option if you cannot divide the number of ballots rejected between uniform services voters and the overseas citizen voters. For question B16, you'll be looking at the total number of transmitted ballots that were rejected, broken out by uniform service voters and overseas citizen voters. And B17, you'll be looking at the total number of FWABs that were rejected, that were cast by uniform service voters and overseas citizen voters. So again, we're making this differentiation between transmitted ballots and FWABs, and we're looking at differences in experience between uniform service voters and overseas citizen voters. So, question B19 is asking about your total UOCAVA registration population. How many individuals in your state were registered to vote as a UOCAVA voter for the 2016 general election? So at a minimum, any voter who registered to vote using an FPCA would be considered a UOCAVA registrant. And if your state allows additional individuals to register as a UOCAVA voter, or they used a state registration form to request UOCAVA status, you would include all of these people. Finally, states vary in how long they allow a UOCAVA voter to maintain that status. And so if you're a state that allows voters to have UOCAVA status across multiple years or multiple election cycles, please report all UOCAVA voters who had status as a UOCAVA voter for the 2016 election. So if somebody registered in 2014 as a UOCAVA voter and they are still considered one in 2016, please include them or anything like that in your total here on question B19. For B19, you're also going to be breaking up the total number of registrants by uniform service members and overseas citizens. Try not to use B19D or B19E unless you just cannot divide up UOCAVA registrants between uniform service members and overseas citizens. So try to use the B and C categories whenever possible for B19. For question B20, you're going to be reporting the total number of FPCAs you received. So here, only report FPCAs, not people who registered as a UOCAVA voter using any sort of state form or anything else, just FPCAs. And for B and C, for 20B and 20C, you're going to be reporting the number of FPCAs that were received by uniform service voters and overseas citizens, respectively. For 21, you're going to be reporting the number of FPCAs that were rejected. Now, here is a very important nuance here. Rejected here means that they were not fully processed. So many states don't actually reject these, they put them in a pending category. If you did not send a ballot to a voter who submitted an FPCA, it is considered a rejection. So if you received an FPCA and it was not complete, for instance, and you did not send that person a ballot, it's considered a rejected FPCA for the purposes of question B21. So please report of the total number of FPCAs you received, the number that were rejected, and here we mean if you did not send them a ballot, it was considered rejected. So for question 24, previously you had to divide up this question into the number of ballots that were sent before and after the 45-day deadline. Here we're just asking for totals now. So, of the ballots that you transmitted to voters, how many did you transmit via postal mail? How many did you transmit via email attachment? And how many did you transmit via some other method, such as an online system or fax. If you transmitted ballots using multiple methods to the same voter, you should report that voter in each of the categories. So for instance, if I was living in Germany and you mailed me a ballot and you also emailed me a ballot, my mailed ballot would go into 24A and my emailed ballot would go into 24B. So then, of those ballots you transmitted, how many were returned as undeliverable? So how many were returned undeliverable by the post office? How many were returned as undeliverable because my email bounced? Or how many of them were returned as undeliverable for some reason from a fax number that you sent a ballot to or something else? So how many times did you transmit a ballot and it was returned to you as undeliverable? For question 26A, here you're only reporting transmitted ballots. How many of them were received back from UOCAVA voters? So only ballots you transmitted. So for question 26A, you're not going to include the federal write-in and absentee ballots. So these are just transmitted ballots. How many were received from UOCAVA voters? So how many of them did you receive back from uniformed services voters? You're going to report that in 26B. And in 26C, you're going to report how many transmitted ballots were received back from overseas citizens. So question 27 is getting at how was that ballot sent back to you? And these are only for transmitted ballots. So again, do not include federal write-in and absentee ballots here. So for question 27, what I want to know is this. Of the ballots that you transmitted to a voter, how did they send that ballot back to you? So if I'm living in Germany and you mailed me a ballot, did I send that ballot back to you via mail? Did I send it back to you via an email attachment? Or did I send it back to you by fax or some other method? Now, if I sent the ballot back to you by mail and I also emailed it to you, you would include both responses. You would include the mailed response in 27A and the email response in 27B. You can skip question 28 because of the way the EAVS has been streamlined. For question 29, you'll want to report the number of UOCAVA ballots that were rejected for being received late. For this question, you will not divide out the totals by the number of ballots that were sent before or after the 45-day deadline. Instead, you're just going to be reporting the number of ballots that were rejected that were received back into your office via postal mail, email attachment, or some other system such as fax or an online portal. And again, for this question, it's how many ballots did you reject that were sent back to you by the voter via postal mail, via email, or via fax. So it doesn't matter how you sent the ballot to the voter. What matters for question 29A is how the voter sent the ballot back to you. The same is true for question B30. Here, these are ballots that you transmitted to voters. So these are ballots that you mailed out, posted on an online portal, or emailed. And how many of them were received back into your office by postal mail, by email, or by fax or an online system. So again, for B30, it's how the voter transmitted the ballot back to you. Did they transmit it back to you by mail, by email, or by some sort of online or fax system? For question 31, we're now entering into the questions that relate to federal write-in absentee ballots, or FWABs. So B31 is how many FWABs were received into your office from UOCAVA voters, and you're going to break this out by voters who are uniformed services voters and by overseas citizens. You can skip question B32 because of the streamlining of the EAVS. For question B33A, you're going to be reporting why federal write-in and absentee ballots, or FWABs, were rejected. So first, in B33A, how many were rejected because they were received after the deadline for receipt of ballots? And for B34A, you're going to be reporting the number that were rejected because the voters transmitted UOCAVA ballot was received and counted instead. So for B34A, this would be a case where a voter mailed in their ballot or sent it via email or fax, and you received it and you received a FWAB as well, and you rejected the FWAB because you counted their regular ballot. Finally, You can skip question B35 because of the way that the EAVS has been streamlined. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. Many of the questions that you have about Section B can be answered using the Supplemental Instruction Manual. If you still do have questions, please feel free to contact us at EAVS@forsmarshgroup.com. Thank you and have a great day.